welcome to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum's movie discussion night. This event is sponsored by the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation with support for the foundation in memory of Pat Finley. Tonight, we are talking about the 2000, and I've seen it listed 2019 and 2020 at different places. But the 2000 I have written down as 2019 movie, The Outpost. I got a lot to say about this movie, but we'll go through my notes first real quick. This is directed by Rod Laurie, who I looked him up. He's done some television, a few movies, but nothing I've ever heard of. So I really wasn't very familiar with him as a director. Cinematographer is Lorenzo Senatore. He's an Italian cinematographer, but he's done a ton of movies, not only as a cameraman, but also as the unit cinematographer as well. Whole list of movies to include X-Men. I can't remember some of the other ones, but he's got quite a lengthy background. And I thought he did a really good job in shooting this film, given the circumstances of what we're looking at. Of course, it's starring Scott Eastwood, Clint Eastwood's son, as Staff Sergeant Romeshay. Also, Orlando Bloom as Captain Keating. Milo Gibson, Mel Gibson's son, as Captain Yescus. Hope I'm saying that right. And Caleb Landry Jones as Specialist Carter. I also thought it was interesting, though, that there was 3 members of the unit who starred in this film, too. So Caleb Landry Jones portrays Specialist Carter, but Specialist Carter was also in the film in just a cameo role. And then also Henry Hughes, who is part of that unit. He starred as Sergeant Brad Larson, and then Specialist Daniel Rodriguez appeared as himself in the film. And I was watching an interview with him just this afternoon, and just how much it really hit home to that guy. Not only being in this event, but then going back and filming it for this movie. It was produced by Millennium Media and York Films, distributed by Screen Media Films, released here in the U.S. on June 3rd of 2020. And I guess maybe that's why you see a lot of 2020s around, even though it was released in Europe in 2019. And it was filmed entirely in Bulgaria, which I thought was a unique location to shoot a film. Everybody's technology is going off. I gotta turn my volume down real quick. Had a budget of $5 million. This is one of those films that we're starting to see a little more and more of that didn't quite make its budget. It only came in with a box office of $2.3 million. And just so I'm not remiss, this film was based on a book by Jake Tapper, a CNN correspondent, called The Outpost, An Untold Story of American Valor. And we're hoping, fingers crossed, I don't want to give too much away, but we're hoping maybe to have him on next year for one of our book talks, talking about this particular book that he wrote. We'll see how that goes. That's going to take a lot of work to get him on our book talk events, but hopefully it works out well. And I also thought it was kind of interesting, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about this either, that when they were starting to put this movie in production, Clint Romeshay actually wrote a book as well on his experience there called Red Platoon. I've read that. I have not read Jake Tapper's book. But it seemed like, from what I could tell and what I've read with some of the interviews with the director and the producers, that there was a bit of a time crunch to get this movie out, or at least done and in the can, before they started work on Clint Romeshay's adaptation of the book. I'm not so sure how I feel about that. Clint Romeshay was actually there. His book is pretty detailed. I'm sure Jake Tapper's is as well, but I'm just not quite sure how I feel about them trying to get one up on one of the actual veterans that was there. Small point, but nonetheless. But starting off with just how we like the film, Chris, what did you think?
I was really drawn to it. I thought there were some sequences that were probably longer than they needed to be. I mean, some of the scenes where they, when they were in the what I guess I would call the barracks area, there was a lot of that they were trying to set the relationships but I thought they set them adequately without going into such length. I thought they could have cut maybe about 10 minutes out, at various points on that. But I thought the battle scene you just kind of I was mesmerized by it, about how well they executed it on film, I thought. So I really liked it. What I wish they had was some background about why the hell anybody chose that spot for that post. I mean, we hear in the movie, and it was pretty obvious that it was not a good place to have an outpost, but there's no explanation about why it was chosen, really. And I would have liked to have heard or seen something, maybe even, a shift to like the Pentagon, where they were deciding how to do this or something like that. Just something to, try to give some rationality to that, if there was any. And I don't think there was, but
somebody thought it was a good idea. I don't know who.
But I mean, I don't think you have to be a military expert by any means to know that you don't want to be in the valley when you're surrounded by mountains and an enemy. It just makes no sense. Especially after you've been.
It says in Inglourious Bastards, you don't have to be a military genius to know you don't want to fight in a basement.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, and particularly when U.S. forces had been in Afghanistan for that long at that point, just didn't make sense to me.
Sally, how'd you like the film?
It was very hard for me to watch. I think because it was too realistic to me. And that sound of those bullets just was driving me insane. Obviously, I've never served in the military. Overall, I really thought it showed what risks our military men take and why they come back kind of crazy.
Especially when you go through something like that. And we saw 2 hours of these guys' lives. They spent months in that hole.
Right.
So yeah, for them to come back and quite honestly, it kind of points to the end of the film. When Staff Sergeant Romachet is calling home, and then Specialist Carter is seeing the psychiatrist. I haven't been able to watch the end at all. I'm not usually affected so much by military films, but I've watched the film twice now, and both times I've had to stop watching it at that last 15 minutes or so. I can't watch it.
So you didn't watch it through the credits?
No.
Oh, because they show some of the actual survivors, and they did and short brief interviews with them at the end during the credits. It's almost so you can't even watch the credits, because
right.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, it took too much of an emotional toll on me, to watch those end scenes. And then, I watched the part with Staff Sergeant Romachet. He just couldn't even talk on the phone to his wife. And then the first few lines of Carter's interview with his psychiatrist, and I had to stop. I couldn't emotionally push forward.
Well, maybe you could skip to the credits.
I don't think that would do me any good either, especially if they're talking with the survivors and maybe doing small interviews with them. I think that would be, that wouldn't work well for me. I enjoyed the film. Sorry, Sally, go ahead.
You gave us that YouTube site.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to that, and initially it was like Chris said, all these interviews with all these guys. And then I don't know how I finally found the right spot. And then it gave me on my cell phone the option, do you want to watch the movie? Yeah, I did. Oh. But those interviews, I was watching those for an hour or so before I watched the movie. So you might be able to watch those without, they weren't quite as bad as the scene where Carter's at the psychiatrist.
Yeah, that one just really tore me up.
Yes, it does.
Man.
Mm-hmm.
Even just thinking about it right now, I'm starting to get a little verklempt.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I did enjoy the film. I thought it was really well shot. Like I said, I thought maybe the direction could have been a little better. Especially like the first half hour. It didn't seem to flow very well, I didn't think. It was kind of choppy. And like Chris was saying, there was a lot of unneeded dialogue going on. And he's right. They're trying to set, this tone between all these guys. This band of brothers type scenario. But it wasn't quite as clean as all that. There was definitely controversies. There's clearly some of these guys just they wouldn't like each other if they had met in the real world. But when you're forced to, in a position like that, whether you like each other or not, that's not really an issue. You got to have your buddy's back, and he's got to have yours, and that's just the way it is. And then the final battle scene, I thought it went maybe a little long, especially going back from this Humvee to that Humvee and spending 5 or 10 minutes watching these guys inside the Humvee, and they're just taking all this fire. I thought that could have been cut a little bit as well, but I thought the battle scene was done really well. I don't want to say I enjoyed it, but I thought it was shot well, and it like Chris said, it drew me in. It really captured my attention.
I don't know if it was the YouTube site I was on or if it was the movie. The dialogue, the first half of the movie, I missed so much dialogue because the soldiers were talking real fast to me and at a low level. And I'm like, what are they saying? It was driving me nuts. And you're right, the Arabic didn't bother me at all.
Yeah, no, after a few minutes, I didn't even notice it was there. Chris, you had the Blu-ray version, the YouTube version that Sally and I watched. It was Arabic subtitle. And
it was interesting.
Yeah, I didn't even, like I said, after a few minutes, I didn't even notice.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Going to my questions here, certainly Chris brought this up right away, and I kind of want to talk about this just a little more. The main problem with the original name of the post was PRT Camdesh before they renamed it to Camp Keating or COP. That's what it is. COP. We have another person showing up too. Nice. Yeah, this site was definitely poorly chosen. And you'd like to think that you have more trust in your military leaders to put you in a position to at least maybe not win, but at least survive. And clearly this post was not put in that kind of position. And I'm still I want to get your opinion on it as well. How does this even happen? And I just want to say, Evelyn, hello. Thanks for joining us tonight. You are muted right now, so I don't know if you're trying to chime in, but welcome. Please join the conversation with us. But yeah, how does somebody think that this is a good idea to put this thing at the bottom of this, mountain formation all the way around you?
That was my question.
It almost seems negligent.
Yeah.
Yes.
The only thing that I could figure was that it was the only geographic formation where you could actually lay out an outpost. I mean, you have all these mountains around, and unless there's a plateau on the mountain, it's kind of hard to set up. I mean, we don't have any indication, for instance, that Taliban actually had any kind of outpost in the mountains. They were hanging around presumably in the village, but you're not going to set up the outpost in the village. So the only thing I can figure is that they thought that they figured this was the only place they could actually set something up to perform the mission that they wanted, which was to try to get the villager, the folks in the village to keep the Taliban away. Other than that, I don't see any reason for it.
Yeah, and if you look at a lot of other posts similar to this, or the combat outpost in Afghanistan, they were up in the hills. They weren't quite as consolidated. Sorry, my dog is just bullying his way through. Jackson, please go later. But we got somebody else showing up here too. All right, we got a little party going on. Excellent. but they did set those up in the hills. Like I said, they weren't as consolidated, maybe a little more spread out. So, you would have your mortar pit, on one side of the hill, and maybe, a couple machine gun posts on the other side. But at least you were elevated. At least you weren't allowing the enemy to take a position above you. That was just so detrimental.
Yeah.
I'm really surprised. And I know this is a true story. I know this really happened, but I'm just really shocked and surprised that there was some military planner out there who said, yes, let's put it here. And there's other people behind him going, okay, yeah.
I know.
It just makes no sense.
It
I
does.
kinda-
Even in Clinton Romashay's book, he's asking the same questions. Even to this day, he's still asking that question. How did this happen?
As I was watching the movie, I was kind of wondering whether, particularly in the aftermath, whether anybody who made that decision suffered any kind of career consequences.
Right.
I know that they did investigations into this, but the only thing that I've read is that the investigations concluded that the soldiers were not at fault. Duh.
Yeah.
I haven't read anything about anybody being held accountable for, this poor planning, putting these soldiers in such a terrible spot. But I certainly hope that somebody was held accountable for that. At the very least, and I'm not holding my breath, but at the very least, I hope lessons were learned for the future. Military planners are supposed to be, at the very least, historians, and you learn from history. And if you don't learn from history, you keep making the same mistakes.
At the end of the movie, they alluded to the fact, they didn't come right out and say, but higher ups, something happened and made a big boo-boo. And that they did say they were not going to do that kind of planning again, whatever that means.
Oh, I feel so much better.
So I saw that.
Yeah, it's so nebulous. It's like, oh, really? Oh, thank you.
You sort of got I sort of got a sense that there might have been some, careerism involved in that decision. It's hinted, to me, it was hinted at in that little anecdote about how they got that huge military vehicle in there, that some colonel decided that it had to be there regardless of what the dangers or risks were.
Mhm.
And that might have been a similar kind of attitude that resulted in the physical location of the outpost.
So we've got this terrible, terrible location, a terrible situation. And by that, I mean, you're trying to not only fend off constant attacks from the Taliban, but you're also trying to work with the villagers themselves, trying to create some sort of, I don't want to say harmony, but at least some sort of understanding. And so we see this scene, and Chris has it up here in the top right, where Captain Keating Orlando Bloom is talking with the leaders of the village, and they're trying to work out some sort of accord. But before he goes, he says something to the effect of that diplomacy amongst their tribes and their elders will work. And this is one of our primary missions, is to make this work. Regardless of what we know now, do you think this is the right path forward for these guys? Do you think that they really didn't have any other options?
I thought there were two things. One was that's a good policy if you can make it work.
Mhm.
The second was that was, I think, the mission that they were assigned. So there really wasn't much choice in terms of, at least I guess Keating didn't think so, in terms of, what he had to do to go out and try to get the unit's mission accomplished. The thing that struck me was, I thought that I didn't get a sense that they were really connecting in the way that you need to connect to make diplomacy work. It was sort of like the Americans were coming in and saying, this is what you need, despite the words that they were using, suggesting, well, tell us what you need. But it sounded like they were telling the village elders what they needed and that the U.S. could supply, rather than saying, what do you need and how can we help you? And I think that would have I think that makes a big difference in terms of how they're going to respond. I mean, we are the occupying force there at that point. It's not like I didn't get the sense they particularly wanted us there. I don't know that they wanted the Taliban, but we were definitely way outsiders. So the burden was kind of on us to try to accommodate them more than them accommodate us.
Excellent point.
Did you want to chime in on that, Sally?
I just said he's making an excellent point. When you talk about diplomacy, especially like we were trained in a work environment, you ask permission of the other person, you find out what their needs are and see how you can go about meeting their needs. This was like contradictory to everything I learned about trying to come to a compromise or I don't know I don't know the word right now, but diplomacy, I guess, but it just was backwards to me.
Yeah, and in like, I think, Chris, you hit it right on the head. You said we were telling them, what they needed, and instead of asking them what they need. They don't need air conditioning and satellite TV and stuff like that. You're not gonna win them over like that. And they really, it didn't seem like they were going that far. They were trying to offer them monetary incentives, to help build roads, just kind of maybe modernize a little bit.
Also, they're a whole different culture, and we're forcing our values on them, and
exactly
they're like,
right.
what are you talking about?
Yeah, and we didn't understand the culture.
No.
And that's been admitted by our military leaders, both high and low, since people have really started looking at our actions in Afghanistan. We just didn't get it. We just went over there. We knew what we wanted to do, and then we kind of tried to learn along the way, but I don't think we learned very well. And as a matter of fact, I know we didn't. There's a good friend of the museum, and he's spoken on a couple different occasions, and he was a battalion commander over there. And he says that we went about it the completely wrong way. We set ourselves up for failure. We gave ourselves objectives that were not achievable. At least when you look at the actions on the ground, it looks great on paper. But when you try to implement that on the ground, they just weren't achievable. We were actually not literally fighting ourselves, but we were fighting ourselves the whole time over there, because we just weren't doing the things that needed to be done. Once again, if you know your history.
As I was watching that scene with the Shura, that at least the first one that they had, what came to my mind was what I've read about the relationship between the Amish and technology. Because we have this perception on the outside that the Amish are just opposed to technology. When in fact, the way it works in the Amish community is that when a new piece of technology comes to their attention and has the potential to be used in their communities, they sit down and they make a conscious decision about whether how that they evaluate the technology in terms of its impact on their community, what their values and so on. And if they don't like it, they reject it, or they accept it in a modified form. And I sort of got the sense with the Shura that they're sitting there thinking, this stuff may not be consistent with what we want for our community. I mean, just the expressions on their faces, maybe the expression in Afghanistan means something different than what it would mean here. But it just seemed to me like enormous skepticism on their part about anything that was being proposed by the American forces.
Yeah, and and it really, they just wanted their money. And I don't mean that as a slight to them, but that was the one thing that was a big motivator in their mind. Even the smallest villages, money talks, and especially if you're the way that the Afghan government has been described to me, is that you need money to be able to buy position, and if you can't buy position, then you are going to be, for lack of a better term, discriminated against by your own people. So when you have these small villages, and if they don't have the resources or the cash to be able to put themselves in a better position, it's really detrimental, especially during this time.
That kind of came up later in the film, a little bit later in the film, I think, with the second Shura, where one of the village elders says, "You promised us the money and we didn't get it."
Yeah, and by this time now you've gone to at least one different commander, maybe two. I can't recall. So now, who knows, between Captain Keating and Captain Yescas, what was said at the first meeting is the same things being repeated at the second meeting? Are we still holding up our bargains? Are we still trying to make the same bargain? I'm sure it was all very confusing for both sides. It's just a mess altogether.
It was.
Looking at some of the characters, especially Romeshay, Staff Sergeant Romeshay, he says that when he calls home, all he does is end up lying. What does he mean by that? I found that line rather interesting.
Well, is he lying to the family member, or is he lying to himself when he's on the phone? That was my question.
That's just it, yeah. Is he, telling his wife everything's fine?
Mm-hmm.
We're not seeing any action. Certainly you want to project that sort of calmness when you are communicating back home. But at the same time, you can't paper over a bad situation.
Right.
And more to your point, Sally, that's kind of the way I was looking. Is he lying to himself? Is he trying to tell himself that everything will be okay? We're all going to walk out of here. It seems like a terrible situation, but in reality, it's not going to go as bad as everybody thinks.
Yeah, I think it was later in the movie, he uses the line of, "Don't even think about your wife."
Right.
Yeah. No, he was.
He can join, or she.
Another voice heard from.
Yes, there's my puppy. Yeah, he was telling, because that one soldier just kept thinking about his girlfriend, during the firefight, and something like that. Yeah, you're right. Don't even think about that. You've got a very serious job to do, and not only for yourself but for the people around you. And your head has to be in it 100%. And of course, I'm not trying to say that my situation was anything near was what there is. Because it certainly wasn't when I was over in Iraq at Desert Storm. But we trained and trained and trained. When we went to war, we were 100% confident that everything was going to be fine and we were going to win. But we never had anybody tell us that our mentality, while we're doing this job, has to be focused on the mission. We were joking and smoking, and we weren't really in a mental headspace. We weren't where we needed to be. Had things got really rough, had we gone up against situations like what these guys had to go through, I think we might have had a serious and maybe very rude wake-up call. And then Captain Keating, were you guys surprised by his death? I was. I was very surprised.
I was, just because Hollywood doesn't usually kill off your main characters right at the beginning. That was a shocker.
And it wasn't like with the Kwame Peterson, who played Captain Broward. No offense to Kwame Peterson, but he's not Orlando Bloom. This is Orlando Bloom. He's one of the biggest superstars out there. And he got 20 minutes and that's it. And he gets crushed by a truck.
He was in his contract. I can't say that I was all that surprised, because it was sort of foreshadowing when they talk about how difficult it was getting the truck in. And so when he says, "Well, I'll take it out," and they're just kind of really worried about about these roads and so on, I kind of figured that something was going to go wrong. So in that sense, it didn't come as a shock. I was kind of surprised it was him in that sense. but it wasn't. I wasn't surprised that there was some catastrophe on that trip. I had thought perhaps more it would be, one of the lead vehicles or something would have, gone over the cliff somehow, but or maybe the Taliban would have, somehow at night been able to, disrupt something. But it did kind of emphasize just how treacherous that road was.
Yeah, I was kind of expecting, maybe a firefight, something like that. I certainly wasn't expecting him to go rolling down a cliff and get crushed. And that actually did happen. Or this Captain Keating, if I'm not mistaken, he was a Marine, not Army. I think I read that in Clint Romaché's book. But yeah, that kind of slapped me across the face. I was like, here we are 20 minutes into the film and we've already lost Orlando Bloom. Where is this going to go now? And unfortunately, it went into this constant rotation of, commanders coming in, yes, Gus, and then he died, and then Bunderman took over for a little while, and then Captain Broward the Coward came in. I really didn't like him. Oh my goodness. These guys are taking fire, and he's telling them you can't return fire until you can actually see somebody shooting it.
Yeah, that was weird.
And Scott Eastwood goes, well, where the hell do you think all these bullets are coming from? It's not just raining lead, there's people out there shooting.
That was weird.
The death of Keating also seemed to me sort of linked up with that brief discussion that occurred later on about, I forget how it actually came up, about how no matter how well prepared you are as a soldier, you can still die. And then they go through the 3 or 4 names of people who they considered to be excellent soldiers, and how momentarily, just the fate, the luck of the draw, they're gone. And so, in a sense, that was what happens with Keating. He decided he was going to drive. He didn't have to drive. He didn't have to take it, but he did. And all of a sudden, there he is down at the bottom of the cliff.
Yeah, and it's it's at least from my experience, and I don't know, maybe it's different nowadays, but you would not see an officer, most 99% of the time. I'll say 90% of the time, you wouldn't see an officer volunteer for that. Yeah. You would maybe shame the other soldiers a little bit until someone finally volunteered. It was good leadership quality, no doubt, but it cost him his life, unfortunately.
I didn't quite understand why he did it.
Because nobody else wanted to drive it.
Oh,
he was asking for volunteers to step forward, and everybody's like, you're crazy.
Yeah, right.
We're not doing that. He said, fine, I'll do it. And like I said, that is a good leadership quality. If you have troops that aren't willing to do something, to see an officer step up like that, even just by him doing that, it kind of shamed, the lower enlisted and maybe some of the senior NCOs. But it's not common, at least not in my experience. And Chris, you just talked about how even the best soldier, can die, no matter how squared away they are. How did you take the song that they kept playing, "Everybody Dies"? That kind of rattled me a little bit. I know what it's like to be around a bunch of guys for months on end, doing a very dangerous job, and some of the things that they were doing, we were doing as well. These aren't things that you would do with your buddies, while you're in the civilian world. But when you're in a combat zone, you do get this special bond that draws everybody together. But some of the stuff they were doing was outrageous. And that song just really was like, oh my God, these guys they have it in their heads that they're not going back, and they're ready for that.
Well, the thing that kind of strikes me it's kind of interesting because in the movie, Carter is treated as kind of a screw up.
Yeah.
and he wins the Medal of Honor, which suggests that no matter how squared away you are or not squared away you are, the luck of the draw is kind of there for you. I mean, Carter evidently, despite everybody's perception of him, manages to rise to the occasion. And despite all his screwing up, comes out with the highest medal that can be conferred. What kind of fate or fortune explains that?
I'd like to know.
Well, I'll go back to when I give the tours at the museum. We tell the stories of Wisconsin veterans, and some of them are pretty outrageous. And some of the most harrowing tales that we relate on the tour are right near the Medal of Honor case. And I've had so many people ask me, how did they do that? How did they become so such a hero? And my response is always, you never know. You never know what you're capable of until you're put in any kind of position. And you could be the biggest screw up, but then that biggest screw up might end up saving everybody's life. And you might be the most squared away, most gung-ho soldier, and you're the first one to go down because you did something stupid, or you weren't, you just weren't thinking. Or like you said, Chris, fate or fortune. It's funny how that works.
Yeah, but I thought that was one of the interesting contrasts that they create with Carter as kind of a screw up, and then talking about how the best squared away soldiers can just die. And you wind up with the examples of squared away soldier like Romeshay. Is that how it's pronounced? Romeshay?
Romeshay, yeah.
Romeshay, and the screw up Carter, and they both wind up basically the heroes of the event.
So we've seen them get attacked a couple different times, and after one particular attack, they go up into the hills. They send out a patrol, and Romeshay is part of them. And he's looking down, and he's basically laying out to his other sergeant, the Taliban is figuring us out. Every single time they attack, they're putting different puzzle pieces together. They're looking at what we're doing, how we respond, where we go. How do you think his assessment compared to the Taliban's assessment? Do you think they were pretty much spot on, both of them, or do you think maybe the Taliban had a different, or wanted to take a different approach that was just as successful as what Staff Sergeant Romeshay was laying out?
I thought that was pretty much in sync. I think what Romeshay was saying was in effect what the Taliban were doing, because each time they attacked, they could see how the unit responded, which things they thought were most significant, where they went to protect themselves or to return fire, and each time they did this, they could begin putting together patterns of response, exactly, which would allow them to be more effective the next time around. It was sort of like it kind of reminded me of the OODA loop. I forget his first name, Boyd, a fighter pilot who was regarded as one of the top fighter pilots the Air Force ever had. He developed what he called the OODA loop, which stood for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, OODA. And whoever got inside the other pilot's loop would win, because he would be doing it faster. And in a sense, that's, I think, what the Taliban were doing without the formality of that kind of explanation. They were trying to get inside the decision loops of the soldiers in the outpost. And so I think Romeshay was right. Each time they attack, they're trying to develop this response. They're figuring out how they can make their final attack and beat us.
Yeah, I think over time, the Taliban saw us as predictable. So I think you're right. They could predict our moves and know when to attack and where and that kind of thing.
And I guess being in such a, the outpost was not very big. I guess no matter what you did, you were going to be predictable. You only had so many options on how to respond, which once again speaks back to the planners and their decision to put this place there. I didn't really look at it this way before, but that's a good point, Sally. They were limited in what they can do. They only had so many options, regardless of what was being, presented to them. There's only so many things you could do.
I want to ask a question about medical care.
Mhm.
Was that outpost set up with different buildings, and one of the buildings was dedicated to a medical facility that was crappy staffed and had crappy supplies, but nevertheless.
Well, and okay, here's another terrible thing about that post. The only way they can get supplies in there was via helicopter. And their
Yeah,
helicopter landing pad was on the far side of a river that separated the landing pad from the main post. So even if you got a helicopter in there to give you supplies, you still stood a very good chance of coming under enemy fire just by going and getting those supplies. And in Clint Romaché's book, he talks about how helicopter pilots, after a while, they refused to go there unless they were in dire need of ammunition or food. Helicopter pilots virtually refused to fly any missions in there because it was just so dangerous, so poorly set up. And then, yeah, you're right. So that affects everything, to include your medical supplies. And they didn't have any blood during the final battle scene, so they had to start a blood transfusion. Lieutenant Bunderman did. Just no good all the way around.
I was wondering, what was the altitude of the outpost? Because as the helicopters were flying in, my understanding is that there comes a point where at a certain altitude, the helicopters themselves have to be specially equipped to handle the thin air and the cold. So I was kind of wondering whether the outpost was at such an altitude where only certain helicopters could actually fly in.
That's I didn't understand it that way from reading Clint Romaché's book. When they first established the post, the way he was describing it was multiple aircraft were coming in, not only to deliver troops, but also abundant amount of supplies. They felt free enough to fly in during the day and night, but it didn't take long for them to figure out that that was not the case, and they really need to alter their air traffic to be able to stay on the safe side. And like I said, it just got so bad where the pilots were refusing to go in there unless it was absolutely dire. And not only that, but we saw as they're trying to call in air support, and I read this in Clint's book as well, the closest helicopter, I guess, position or station that could fly in there was about 70 miles away. There was others that had access to more materials and more supplies, some as far as 200 miles away. So not only, and here we go once again, so not only do we have a poorly placed combat outpost, a horribly placed helicopter landing supply point, but then also the places where you're getting your supplies from are so far away that it makes it, I don't want to say impossible, but seriously difficult to even get in there. Even if you weren't going to come under any fire, to fly a helicopter for 200 miles in one way, that's a pretty big ask. And then as far as the altitude, Chris, I know they said at the beginning that they were in the Hindu Kush Mountains, but they didn't say if they were up there or at the very bottom of them. So I'm not sure about that. But if you're anywhere around the Hindu Kush Mountains, I'm assuming you're going to be at altitude, even at the base. So Captain Yescas Yasia, I'm butchering his name. I know I am, and I apologize if he ever watches. Well, no, I'm sorry, he won't. My bad. But he dies on the bridge, suicide bomb. And the soldier that he's with, younger, he doesn't handle it very well at all. He for lack of a better description, he maybe tries to commit suicide. Scott Eastwood's character is able to talk his gun away from him, and then they put him on a helicopter the next day and they get him out of there. What did you think about that? Why do you think that was the right decision? And I'll kind of reference back to a movie that we watched at the very beginning of doing these, All Quiet on the Western Front, and it was almost doctrine back then that you don't reward cowards with transportation out from the front. But do you think this was the case with Younger?
I think Younger had to go. I think he totally snapped and was totally unreliable. I don't think he could be trusted with a gun. I don't think he could be trusted to do anything military. He was just needed psychiatric care. He was just broken. That's how I perceived it.
Yeah. I thought in addition, with something like that, you have to be concerned about sort of the viral character of that attitude. Yeah. That if it starts to spread, you're in real trouble. So if, it's like clearing out a disease as quickly as you can.
Yeah, and this isn't a World War I trench where you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of guys down there. This is a small outpost. You've got less than 50 people. So you're right. That's a good point, Chris. Not only, like Sally said, could he not be trusted? And he just, and like I said at the beginning of this talk, these guys had to know for sure that, I have your back and you have mine. And they couldn't count on Younger after that. But then you're right, that viral attitude, how it might spread and just, create low morale, maybe disharmony. And with something so small in such a dangerous place, you don't need disharmony and low morale.
Well, you had that lecture earlier in the movie about the substance abuse.
Oh, the guy smoking hash.
Yeah, similar kind of thing. I mean, and the emphasis on you have to be there for us. We can't have you. We have a lot. What do you say? A lot of people came here with substance abuse, but you're the only one that's still persisting.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And he just was that Keating, I think, who gave that lecture. Yeah. He realizes that, like you say, it's a small group. Everybody has to rely on everybody else. You can't have a broken wheel. You can't have a broken spoke.
We're running down on time here. I want to maybe shift to something a little more lighthearted, I suppose. Did any of you at any point in the movie, when Scott Eastwood was giving a line, making a move, whatever, did you just go, "Oh my God, it's his dad"? You're muted there, Sally. Sorry.
Yes, I did. All of a sudden, I turned away for a minute and I went, I hear Clint Eastwood's voice. And I look and there's somebody else with that voice projection and the way he talked through his teeth, just like his dad did. I don't think he looks a lot like his dad. His dad's far better looking to me, but whatever.
No, there was a couple times that I was just like, I was kind of floored. And once or twice, I even thought he looked just like his dad too. But definitely
a profile shot. Yes,
the
you're
way
right.
he delivered those lines, he sounded just like him. I expected to be watching Pale Rider for a second. And then also along with the actors, what kind of emotional and, well, certainly physical, that was a physical film. Those guys, they were working. They earned their money, just as far as the physicality goes. But how do you think how do you think an actor stands up emotionally when you're filming something so serious?
I would think they had a rough time of it. I think if you really are tuned into that role and those fight scenes, I don't know how you could, unless you're a psychopath, come away touched by it. It's just it was emotionally draining for me to watch that. And then, like you said, the ending, that was tough to watch. But I kept thinking of all the people I know who served in the military, and whether you saw action or not, it was always a possibility.
Oh, certainly,
So
yeah.
those things always are running through your mind, and you don't come back the same. You just, how can you?
I kind of
Sorry,
wonder whether there might have been some additional emotional toll on the actors who were not veterans, being in a movie where some of the cast had actually been there in the middle of that whole thing. I would think that there would be some emotion plus going on there when realizing that that not only were you in this thing, you know, portraying it, but these guys had to relive it.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially that,
Was it Rodriguez?
Yeah. He was part of an interview that I was watching. It was a thing with Jake Tapper. And they were showing, you know, the filming over there, and they were talking to some of the actors and some of the veterans that had been there. Rodriguez in particular, he didn't seem, he seemed okay, but he was just saying that this is so surreal to have lived through that event, and now we're back, you know, or not back here, but now we're filming. But in particular, Caleb Landry Jones, who played Specialist Carter, when they're interviewing him, he's standing right next to the real Specialist Carter, you know, who I said had a cameo role, and he couldn't look at him, even though that they were asking him questions and they were having, you know, answers that kind of bounced off each other. He couldn't look at him, and the way his face looked, he was just so white and so withdrawn. And he said, you know, look at me now. I'm a wreck. And we're only halfway through filming this. We still have another half to film. And I guess they had psychiatrists on the set to be able to talk to the actors and get them through some really hard parts. You know, I've always wanted to be an actor like that. But now that I see what these guys really have to go through to really get, you know, a good role and really put out a quality product, it's got to be awfully difficult to just turn on and turn off these things that you're going through while you're portraying these characters, and then all of a sudden go back to who you really are. And it really makes sense why a lot of actors are messed up people. We are just about out of time. I want to ask always my last question though. Who was your favorite character and why? And Sally, we'll start with you.
I was torn between several, but I think I liked the transformation of what's his name? The guy that they felt was a loser, a mess up, and then he turned it out to be the hero of the movie.
Carter.
I liked how he evolved. Carter, thank you. I liked how Carter evolved. And you know, they said he was a screw up, but dang, it was hard to run back and forth between bullets to get all that ammunition. I don't know. I felt kind of sorry for him. I'm like, dang, I don't want to be the water boy. But that was just me.
Chris?
I had trouble finding a favorite, really. It was much easier to think of who I didn't like, and that was Broward.
Oh,
yes, exactly.
I mean, I thought that all the actors really did fine jobs with the roles that they had, and that if you're going to try to figure out who your favorite is, you're kind of looking for somebody who did a better job in his role than the others did in theirs. And I just kind of felt that in terms of the roles that they were assigned, and the way the whole film evolved, that they were all, it was really an ensemble piece of work. And without any one of them doing as well as he did, the movie kind of falls apart, I thought. So I just thought, you know, sort of my favorite would have been the ensemble. And my least favorite, of course, was Broward, because, and all I could figure was that he was in there. I mean, I think they could have left him out entirely, even though it wouldn't have been accurate, but they could have left him out and the movie would have been none the worse.
No, I agree. Yeah, he really didn't. I mean, except for, that coarse, feeling that everybody got from him, he really didn't add much to the film. You're right. He could have been, we wouldn't have missed him very much at all if he wouldn't have been.
The only thing he added, I thought, was indirectly with the lecture that, what was it, Bunderman gave, about, he went through all this stuff in Iraq or whatever it was. And so I don't want to hear another thing about that nickname.
Yeah.
But I mean, at most he served as a contrast to the others. But I don't think they needed that contrast in the movie.
My favorite character had actually one of the smallest parts, which I was surprised. I've always been a big Orlando Bloom fan. And for this English kid to throw on that Texas accent and put himself across as a company commander, I thought he did an outstanding job. I was rather impressed. I was kind of cringing at first, trying to see, how's he going to play this, and is any of his accent going to come through? I've never heard him with anything else but his British accent. But I thought he did a fantastic job as Captain Keating. I was marginally impressed by his acting abilities in this film, which isn't saying a lot. I mean, like I said, I've always thought he was a fine actor, but I think he just took it up another notch for this film, even though it was such a small part. Next month, we will be looking at the 1984 film, The Killing Fields, which another one I have not seen, so I'm really interested in watching this. October was crazy for us at the museum with our cemetery tours, our biggest event of the year, week long. Thousands of people came through. So, and then, setting up for that and then tearing everything down, we're still not even done yet, really, as far as, being back to some sort of normalcy. Not to mention everything else that we had going on. So November, the load lightens considerably. So please look forward to questions a lot sooner. And I'm really, really hoping for a great discussion. And I do just want to point out before we sign off also, I did bring up, and it wasn't, meant to tie in, but I did bring up earlier about All Quiet on the Western Front. There is a new version, a 2022 version that comes out on Netflix today. It looks intense. It looks really intense. And as soon as we get done here, I'm going to go watch it. But if you do have access to Netflix, I'd recommend it. It's got great reviews already. And it's one of my favorite films. So I'm really curious to see how it's done in 2022 as opposed to 1930.
Okay, cool.
I just suggest, I think a while back I suggested one of the movies was a movie called Foxhole, which was about, it takes the same group of characters and puts them in the Civil War, World War I, I think, and Iraq.
Oh.
And it's not a literal foxhole, but I just read about it and I had not seen it. I have since seen it, and you might want to take a look at that. It's an interesting approach. All the actors, you get a sense of the evolution of the female character, who and the role that the women would have played in each of those instances. So, if you get a chance, I think it's on. I think Prime Video has it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's out on DVD or Blu-ray yet, but I liked it. So I just recommend that.
I will say this, Chris.
Yeah.
I'm putting together my movies for next year. So just count on this one being in the rotation. It does sound very interesting,
Okay.
and I'm curious now.
Yeah. I was too.
I wish you wouldn't have mentioned it just yet, because now I'm like, well, do I go watch that or do I go watch All Quiet on the Western Front?
Watch both of them.
What's that?
Watch both of them.
Oh, I don't have much energy tonight. But thanks everybody for showing up. I look forward to seeing you all next month.